first, we have Jonathan Rios, an education video game designer and researcher, here for a history lesson on educational games, their unfortunate downfall, and a way to avoid their mistakes.
All right. My name, Jonathan Rios. I love to research and design and look up and play a whole bunch of sets of learning games, educational games. Any type of game that encourages the use of a serious application, I'm all for it. My dream game, of course, is making my own learning games to be used in schools, for middle school, college, anything, hit me up. I'm a math graduate from Rutgers University all the way in New Jersey, moved down to Texas, having a fun time here, and thinking about joining Texas A&M. That's not important. What's important right now is to talk about chocolate-covered broccoli, the educational video game tragedy. Just to cover some credentials, there isn't much in terms of educational game design courses out there, but the ones that are available I have taken. The one in the bottom right, that's filled with crayon, that's an online course that was unavailable to take, but all the lessons are free to view. So I took all of them and it's like, trust me on this, I did the coursework. So, some axioms, just to clear things up so everybody's on the same page. Every video game requires you to learn gaming mechanics. So you learn in essentially every video game. Educational video game is a little bit too much of a umbrella term. It covers a lot of different sub games. I tend to change the term into a learning video game or a learning game. If I ever say one or the other, just know that I'm referring to the same thing. Some of you may be aware of serious games. Serious games often teach you one singular lesson, like a political issue, a theme. I know a popular one is talks about issues that are happening in other countries. But for learning games in general, it focuses on a range of lessons to learn. This rant exclusively focuses on just digital games. Board games, card games, and tabletop games are also related to learning games, but that's not the prime focus of what this talk is going to be about. So let's do some fun interactive. Let's go back in time, way back into the 90s. Let's look at some of the popular CD-ROM games that were out there. Okay. Type in. I got Discord chat open. Type in Party Parrot if you recognize at least one of these games. If you played one of them. We got Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, Math Blaster, Humongous Games with Spy Fox, Pup Pup, Pajama Sam, Rita Kindergarten. Of course, the ever famous Oregon Trail. All these super popular CD-ROM games, or I forget what the other term is, software that nearly every kid had with their PC. Excellent. Yeah, I see it. The bottom 101 is Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. To the left is the cover, and to the center is the gameplay. Right? So a couple of things to notice about all these games is that they were essentially created and made famous during the 1980s and 90s. Another thing to notice is that they are all CD-ROM games. You could call it a boom in children's software media. If you were to take a look, for example, at a Wikipedia of all the notable educational games, this is by no means comprehensive, you can see an interesting trend begin to develop. While there's a bunch of new games that appear in the 80s and 90s, there is a drop-off. Every year there's 1 to 2 notable learning games, and then by the turn of the millennia, there's one learning game a year. Right here, right in the 2000s, there's a 5-year scarcity. Scarcity is one of the two. Learning games just dropped off the face of the earth. It sucks, but here's the short answer as to what happened. Learning game oversaturation. Because CD-ROM games became so easy to make, a lot of companies hopped on the bandwagon. As we approach closer and closer to the turn of the new millennia, more and more CD-ROMs are being produced. What winds up happening is that with Math Blaster, with Reader Rabbit, with a bunch of those titles made by very smart companies, just like there was a video game crash of 1983, the educational game also went through the same trials and tribulations. Also around the same time, Web 2.0 was rising. out of the ashes of Web 1.0, and CD-ROMs just weren't as popular as they could have been. All these educational software companies were eventually merged into Mattel and Cendent, who were less concerned about the R&D and more focused on just the bottom line. Right? That's the short answer. This is the long answer. Comes from The Ecology of Games, Connecting Youth, Games, and Learning by Katie. It's a very, very good read. It's a fun read. This was before my time, so a lot of information here I could have understood without the help of this book. But this is essentially what we're left with in the early 2000s. Okay, R&D is way too expensive. Stick with what has been currently developed for making new learning games. All right. What that turns into is never develop new innovative ways to understand the learning pedagogy. Only make games when we have the opportunity to grab their license, like for SpongeBob, Shrek, Sonic. I'm sure there's a bunch of these games that you've seen for Leapster, where it's like, come learn your ABCs with Tinkerbell. Software companies are never allowed to establish their own brand, usually because there is no money to fund it. And as an added insult to injury, when you create these learning games, you usually have to incorporate a sort of learning instructor or an instructional designer to help you understand if what you're teaching is correct. But if there's no money to do that, you can only stick to what's already easy to teach, which is a very, very, very young demographic with their ABCs and addition. So now, since we know all of this, what's an easy way to make better learning games if you were interested in producing a product to be used in schools? Since everyone here is a game designer, I want everyone to look at these games and sort of figure out what are some common threads that all of them have. Two reputable games here that I absolutely adore is this right here, bottom left, Plague Inc., and then bottom right, Kerbal Space Program. The common thread that all of these games share is that the academic subject that they want to make was fun. So if you want to make a learning game, whether it be about algebra, biology, or history, government policies, whatever it is, you have to treat the subject itself as fun. Plague Inc. I can't remember. I should have remembered the person's name. The person who designed it. He created in his spare time a game that he thought was absolutely cool. He wanted to make a virus simulation game where you could fight against humanity. Kerbal Space Program. Those guys, they loved rockets. They absolutely adore rockets, and they want to make a game about rockets. And this is why their games are extremely, extremely successful. Because if the academic subject you're trying to make a game for you don't feel as fun, then the game, I can guarantee, won't be fun as well. Right? If it's not fun, then why bother? All right. I still have more than like 5 minutes left. I'm looking at chat. Does anybody have any questions?
While the chat is kind of gathering together their questions, I did have one I'd like to ask you, if you don't mind, Jonathan, which is, when you're looking at this framework, have you seen any kind of sort of specific best practices or ideas of sort of how to approach finding the fun in an educational context?
Finding the fun. That stems from your own gaming history. If you've played many different types of games, you'll be able to easily establish what types of fun could be extracted from an academic subject. So, if you're trying to force your way into a academic subject, if you were trying to discover what makes calculus fun, and you have very little experience about sort of how to learn calculus, you may actually need to get a learning designer or instructional designer or a professor, a teacher that teaches calculus to tell you why this subject is interesting and engaging and fun. Because that does communicate well into video games, if you know how.
That's fantastic. From Tyler Tomaseski, he asked, do you think the pivot in what educational games look like has come at the cost of their ability to teach? Like, has the change in what we see now as educational games, has that change sort of altered their ability to actually teach people?
It's in terms of evolution, these were entertainment games that were retrofitted to become educational games. The Kerbal Space Program, I'm absolutely sure, when it first came out, was not a game that was conceptually thought to be capable of teaching rocket science. But after the game came out and after the game received its feedback, they retrofitted it to be more along the lines of what you learn in actual rocket science. Same thing with Plague Incorporated. The person that made Plague Incorporated, Plague Inc., said he had no experience on the study of viruses. He just wanted to make a cool virus game. And when the game came out and it became an overnight sensation, he was met with several different virologists on improving the game or making the game better this way or mentioning that this game is unrealistic in this manner. So the old educational games that came out in the 1990s, they're done. It's over. What we have now that takes their place is entertainment games that have been slowly turning into educational games. It's a long-winded answer, but I think that covers it all.
No, it's very fair. Camille asks, how does the switch to mobile, how has that affected educational games? Like, they said that they feel like that definitely had a play in sort of outdating and oversaturating the market. So do you anything from your experience in terms of mobile and education games?
Mobile games are difficult to facilitate. Even though many different companies like to engage in mobile games and using mobile games to sort of teach kids or teach students, they're very, very difficult to overlook to see if the students are learning by playing the game. I don't think the mobile learning game market is anywhere near powerful enough to sort of infiltrate academia. My end goal in all of this and all the learning games here is to eventually replace homework altogether. The conceptual idea of having to go through a project or a homework can be replaced by specific video games. That is feasible. It is absolutely possible. But it will never replace a classroom, and it will never replace sort of the lecture hall. It's meant to accompany it.
I feel like already I want to know what your next Microtalk is. Just the idea of replacing homework altogether with games is amazing. 2 questions. I'll try and get to them very quickly.
Yes.
Riley asks, what are your thoughts on game creation genres like Nintendo's Game Builder Garage or the PlayStation Dreams? What do you think of those as educational tools?
They're absolutely fun sandbox experiences. When it comes to a young developing mind, anywhere, and by developing mind, I mean anywhere from like 5 to 20 years old, you have to have the ability to have a sandbox to create what you like. And the more freedom you have in the sandbox and the more engaged you are with the sandbox, the more your mind begins to grow and conceptualize more and more abstract ideas. They are a starting point, but there's still a long ways to go.
The final question I had to say for the end from Justin is, what kind of educational game do you want to make? What would you like to see in existence?
I tutored high school algebra and high school calculus. There were so many students that were heartbroken and absolutely distraught that they couldn't get a question correct, and they had to try it 5 times over to even begin to understand what they were doing wrong. I want a game to replace and motivate and re-innovate those students to say, that boss was challenging, but after defeating the boss the 5th time, I finally got it. I finally understood what it meant to do PEMDAS or to do foiling or to use the unit circle properly. These are the games I personally want to make or I want to assist in creating.